Chapter 11. Immortality. Each soul slumbers a little while on the shadowy side of the stream, and waking remembers life with a smile as a tale once told in a dream. Spirit never dies. All too often, those who search for the soul's immortality do so in answer to the question, will a man live again? And they cloud the issue, for if a man be immortal, he never dies, nor is he ever born. He simply is. That which has no ending can have no beginning, and that which has no beginning or ending is timeless and infinite, is pure being, exists forever. It is apparent that the body is not immortal. It has an obvious beginning and an obvious end. What we expect to be immortal in man is thus invisible, is spirit, is a mysterious presence that animates body with consciousness. Each of us knows this presence very well, for it is what we feel ourselves to be. It is what we refer to when we say, I. This I, then, this consciousness we know to be ourselves, is what we expect to be perpetuated after the death of the body. What and who is this I? Is it the accumulated memories of a lifetime? Is it the knowledge each of us has attained? Is it some central perception station at the nerve endings of the five senses? Perhaps it is all of these, but it is a certainty that it is consciousness. For only that which is conscious is capable of referring to itself as I. And consciousness is invisible. True, we mark consciousness in another being by observing that it is animated, but we never see this consciousness, never touch or hear it. It exists within the very depths of the creature, and we understand it at all only by understanding the consciousness in ourselves. There are not different kinds of consciousness. Consciousness is consciousness. The sense of self that peers from behind your eyes is the same sense of self that peers from behind the eyes of your neighbor. Though this awareness is never at the same identical stage of development in any two beings, the difference is always one of degree and never of kind. One self pervades the universe, and differentiating in an attempt to know itself better, it attains finiteness and uniqueness by becoming multiplicity instead of unity. Each creature is thus an expression of the immortal self. There is that within it which was never born and which will never die. The false I. What is this deathless, ageless spirit that each of us senses within himself? How ephemeral it seems, and how difficult to understand. Like mercury, it slithers from under our fingers the minute we try to grasp it. For a second, a moment, we have a flash of insight, so that we seem right on the verge of discovering some mighty secret. Then we begin to think about it, and it disappears, leaving us wondering if we haven't imagined it. Something blocks us away from the discovery. Some false habit of thought bars us from true knowledge of self. The culprit is the ego, the erroneous sense of self which we accumulate during our lifetimes. The death of the ego, which we fear so much, is the very thing we must achieve before we take unto ourselves the consciousness of immortal self. Let us reconsider the timeless, spaceless qualities of universal subconscious mind, which has no beginning and no end, which is conscious, but not self-conscious, and which is immortal being. Self, without beginning or end, incarnates, and in so doing becomes something with a beginning. Anything with a beginning must have an end, and so the cycle of birth and death of physical bodies is established. With the birth of the physical body, there is gradually built up something subtle and deluding, the accumulated experience undergone by self within body, which gives rise to a sense of separateness and isolation, and is ego. This is memory of the beginning of physical experience, and we are deluded into calling it I. In this manner we fail to perceive our true being, identify ourselves with the shallow and transitory little ego, and are shut away from the infinite and immortal intelligence from which we have sprung. Nearly everyone considers his ego to be his true self, and as a result is totally unable to comprehend a life after the death of the physical body. He remembers the birth of his ego in his first experiences and thoughts, and thus he senses the ego's inevitable end. Since he identifies himself with ego, he either looks forward with fear to undesirable oblivion, or refuses to consider the matter of eventual death at all. If fear has been sufficiently ingrained in him by the practitioners of masochism, he even fancies himself faced by the possibility of providing an eternal roast for the fires of hell. Rebirth of consciousness. Ego, the tinsel trapping of self-awareness, is the undoing of us all. It bars us from consciousness of universal self. It perceives all things as existing outside of consciousness, and thus deludes us into believing that things originate on the physical plane. It loads us with the sense of personal responsibility, engenders bitterness and hate by its fancied wounds, sees itself as a speck in the limitless universe, and blows itself up all the bigger in a hopeless attempt to fill infinity. The question is not how the ego shall live, but how the ego shall die. For only when the ego dies do we truly begin to live. The ego is mortal. It has its beginning and it has its end. When death overtakes the body, it overtakes the ego also. Freed at last from delusion, self knows self and sees its immortality. The fear of death then springs from the ego's fear of dissolution, but only because we cling to the ego as our true selves. He who perceives at the center of consciousness the great self which is buried there, lets go of the ego forever and moves in tune with the infinite. The death of the physical body frees us from all the bonds of the ego, but the unshackling of these bonds during our lifetime brings power. The death of the ego, then, is not a thing to be avoided, but a thing to be welcomed, a spiritual awakening that illumines all things, a transfiguration wherein the soul becomes fused with immortal self. It is attained through humility, through love, through non-resistance, through fusion with universal subconscious mind at the center of consciousness. Who achieves this consciousness perceives immortality. Walt Whitman. Afar down I see the huge first nothing. I know, I was even there. I walked unseen and always, and slept through the lethargic mist, and took my time, and took no hurt from the fetid carbon. Long ago I was hugged close, long and long. Immense have been the preparations for me. Cycles ferried my cradle, rowing and rowing like cheerful boatmen. For room to me stars kept aside their own rings. It avails not, time nor place, distance avails not. I am with you, men and women of a generation, or ever so many generations hence. Jesus, lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world. Immortal self, one mind, one spirit, one self, pervades the universe, and its purpose is to know itself. It is primal stuff, first cause of all things, and is engaged in a work of expanding consciousness. Neither space nor time exist in it, for it is infinite, nor does it adhere to any form, for it is all form. It is becoming things. It becomes all things, and each form it creates is an expression of its knowledge of itself. It is eternal now, which is all times past, present, and future. It is one place, which is all places and any place. It is invisible. It is spirit. It is intelligence. It is mind. It is God. Incarnating into form, it becomes that form, and when the form dissolves, the spirit again becomes universal. It is this in man which is immortal, not the body nor the ego, not the personality but the self. He who attains to awareness of the self and life attains to power. From the Upanishads, the one self within all beings becomes different according to what it enters, and exists also without. Self is universal subconscious mind, which is infinite. All of it exists within each of us, and all of it exists without, for infinity is absolute unity and cannot be divided. It is this that Jesus meant when he said, "The Father in me, and I in the Father." Therefore, if we would perceive our immortality, we must perceive the timeless being that exists at the center of our consciousness. But whether we attain this illumination or not, we are immortal still. Everlasting life is not given to some and taken from others, for we are all one in reality. To him who is held firm in the bonds of ego, the veil will yet be lifted when the physical body dies and the ego ceases its delusion. Then he shall know as he is known, shall see self in self, shall perceive in an instant the vast reaches of infinity. But a degree of this power and perception can be ours in this life, if we can only forsake the ego and take unto ourselves the mantle of God. Forsaking the ego. Ego proceeds from conscious mind, though they are not identical. Conscious mind is the reception station at the nerve endings of the five senses. It is a classifying, tabulating, analyzing machine governed solely by sensory stimuli and perceiving all things as existing outside it. It builds habit patterns of work and a mass of experience and perceives the movement of time. Thus, the ego is compounded of memory and prompts us to act always in the light of experience. According to the ego's conception, so our lives become. This thing we falsely call I, this ego, sees its limitations and brings those limitations into our lives. It fears and hates and envies, for it seeks constantly to puff itself up by vain posturing, by blind attitude, and it brings into our lives the physical results of these mental causes and keeps us constantly in chains. So it is that a man must first be meek and humble before he can enter the kingdom of heaven, before he can become fused with immortal self. Sometimes he comes to it through great suffering, sometimes through despair, sometimes through pain. But always the ego is reduced to nothingness before the portal swings open. And the ego does not surrender lightly. This posturing little elf with its blind delusions would have us believe it is our true self, and when we attempt to cast it aside, we feel its struggles in the very depths of our souls. So great is its resistance that men mortify the flesh, practice celibacy, abstain from all sensual pleasure in an attempt to ignore the evidence of the senses so that the ego might leave and the center of consciousness be revealed. The ego is what we seem to be. The knowledge of what we truly are lies at the center of consciousness. Such knowledge is perceived only by him who strips the ego bare, casts it aside like a worn-out garment. There is a kind of death in this, because we are accustomed to regard the ego as our true self, but the ego shall die anyway, and he who achieves its death in life attains power. Said Jesus, unless a man be born again, he shall not enter the kingdom of heaven. Seek the death of the ego, and be born anew in the knowledge of self. It is the self that is immortal. It is the self, universal subconscious mind, which we truly are. All men have everlasting life, and it is not a question of whether we shall live again, but the insistent and glorious fact is that our real selves shall never die, just as they are never born. The spirit is birthless and deathless and changeless. The afterlife. What will the afterlife be like? It will be like stepping from the consciousness of a gnat into the consciousness of infinity. With the death of the physical body, we shrug off the bonds of conscious mind and ego, lay aside the limitations of flesh, and become one with universal subconscious mind, pervading all times and places. We shall have no bodies in the hereafter, for we shall be all bodies. We shall be in no specific place in the hereafter, for we shall be in all places. We shall not meet old friends and loved ones in the hereafter, for we shall all be one, unified, indivisible, one self, one mind, one eternal I. The question is sometimes asked, what good is a hereafter like that? Unless a man have a body and 5 senses and things to accomplish and friends to meet with, what good is it? Wouldn't oblivion be better? And the only answer possible to this question is that oblivion is inevitable for the part of any man that asks this question, for it is the ego that poses it. It is conscious mind built up of the experience of the 5 senses that seeks to perpetuate itself, and it is no more than a flower, a bud on the everlasting shoot, flowering in season and withering out of season. Life, with its give and take, serve and be served, strive and accomplish, cannot in any manner be compared with existence in the hereafter. Life is the ego's day in the sun. The hereafter is the eternity of the self. Moments of mystical experience. Space and time and body are the means by which universal subconscious mind seeks an ever greater self-awareness. From infinity, immortal self incarnates in space and time, and what it becomes is an expression of its knowledge of itself. As its idea of self enlarges, it withdraws from body and incarnates again in a higher expression. All evolution follows this path, constantly upward, always increasing in self-awareness. To everyone at some time in his life has come the startling magnitude of his own consciousness, perhaps for a second only, and he has been overcome by the question, why do I live at this particular time, in this particular place, in these particular circumstances? Indeed, what miracle has caused me to exist at all? And at that moment he stands very close to the veil, almost sees through it, but not quite. Almost understands what is beyond it, but not quite. He is startled and a little uncomfortable, seized by a strange sense of vertigo, wondering whether life itself is not a dream. Asleep, he has fallen into at some dimly remembered place, from which he will awaken at any moment. But usually, he shuns aside this rare moment of mystical experience, and concerns himself again with the workaday material world, taking assurance from the solidity of physical objects and the sharp definition of sensory perception. Thus he lives like an ostrich, burying his head in the sands of life, and refusing to examine the most miraculous thing of all, his own consciousness, where it has come from and where it is going. Our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. Heaven lies about us in our infancy. Shades of the prison house begin to close about the growing boy. William Wordsworth. sprung from the everlasting self into life. There is in each child the remembrance of universal subconscious mind. But as his ego develops, as he attains memory of sensory experience and the conscious mind grows, the memory becomes dimmer and dimmer, until at last he can recall it no longer, blocked from its view by the posturing ego which clutters the vision of the spirit. So it was that Jesus said, "Unless ye become as little children, ye shall not enter the kingdom of heaven." The animating presence. That which is, was never born, and shall never die, is the very being of each of us. One self, one mind, one life is in everyone. There is no difference between your neighbor and yourself except that of ego, of conscious mind. The difference you perceive is the difference brought about through thought. For your neighbor is a product of every thought he has ever had, even as you are. Since it is impossible for two reactive beings ever to have the exact same kind and sequence of thought, there never has been, nor will there ever be two identical humans, short of union with God. And union with God is achieved by all when the worn house of the body is laid aside at last. It may be achieved in life only when the individual ceases to think and responds to the stimuli of the senses and originates thought at the center of consciousness. Then, free of the bondage of flesh, he achieves power, control over all the circumstances of his life. Everyone knows that he exists, and not simply because he observes other individuals responding to him. That which he feels himself to be, he knows as consciousness, lying within his body, yet not his body. He observes other animated beings around him and correctly supposes them to be possessed of the same kind of consciousness as he. And he further observes death overtake the bodies of a few of these beings, and notes that the animating presence has departed. He does not see where the presence has gone and is mystified, for he does not know if it has simply left or has suddenly ceased to be. He further observes that this condition of death or departure of the animating presence of the body is inevitable to all forms of life, and thus is inevitable to him. And he vainly tries to peer beyond that event in order to determine if he might not still continue to exist after his body has ceased to function. Alas, the veil is too great for him, for he cannot imagine an existence without his body. And so at last he throws up his hands in despair and decides that his consciousness resulted from the fantastic array of circumstances that produced his particular body, and that on either side of birth and the grave there is nothing but oblivion. But no man completely accepts this delusion, no matter how vociferously he may proclaim it, no matter how valiantly he assumes to face this horrid assumption. There is something in him that knows differently. That something is self, the presence that animates his body. Birthless, deathless, and ageless, it knows its immortality. Self is not body. Your body is not you. If it were and your leg were amputated, part of your consciousness would be lost with your leg. Neither are you simply brain. If you were only brain, then the rest of the physical body could be stripped away and the brain would continue to live. Actually, the brain itself does not even think. Some invisible thinker merely uses the brain as a central reception station for sensory perception. Someone, something, is dwelling in your body, peering through the windows of your eyes, listening at the portals of your ears, using your brain to receive impressions, invisible, hidden, gowned with your particular form, but an instant in the eternity of its being. It uses your body as an idea, then discards it and departs to whence it came. This is immortal self. People want to know where they will go when they die, And the answer to that question is that they will go everywhere, for they don't truly go, they simply expand. Self, freed from the limitations of body, becomes universal self, the consciousness of all time, all space, all form. Since self is free of all limitation and multiplicity, it leaves behind personality and ego and conscious memory, which become immersed like the tiniest drop of water in an infinite sea. Ego goes, limitation goes, the inconceivably small I is replaced by the great I of infinity. A very intelligent but very egotistical man once said, "I cannot stand any conception of the afterlife in which I cease to be me and become somebody else, even if that somebody is much greater." And there are plenty of people whose idea of the hereafter hinges on there being plenty of social life, good food and good fellowship, lots of money and pleasure, and no pain. When it is pointed out to them that they will need to take their bodies along in order to enjoy these things, they nod with equanimity, apparently convinced that an exact replica of the one they leave behind will be furnished them in the hereafter. Behind every pair of eyes, it is always ego that blocks immortality from view. For ego cannot see beyond its own finiteness. It needs a body, needs separateness. For from these conditions it has sprung, and it projects a hereafter that revolves around bodies and personalities. Body and personality and conscious mind change throughout life. How shall they exist then in the hereafter of the ego? Will they be those which we possessed in the prime of life? Then what of the infant taken in death? What of the cripple and the chronically diseased? And how shall our characters and minds be in such a hereafter? As they were at the peak of life? But what of the feeble-minded and insane, and the murderer and the robber and the depraved? A strange hereafter of confusion and injustice, which individuals longing for better bodies, such as the hereafter of the ego. But we needn't worry about it. It doesn't exist. Beyond the advent of death, body does not persist, nor personality, nor ego, nor conscious mind. For all these are the illusory trappings of finiteness, for which we have no further use when we return to the infinite. The great self enters into each body, and becomes different according to what it enters, but upon leaving again becomes absolute infinity and unity. The infinite, says Emerson, lies stretched in smiling repose, and so does the immortal self, eternally one, the true being in every man, the observer who looks out upon the world through every pair of eyes. Reincarnation. One of the interesting theories held by those who demand a body as a prerequisite to any existence after death is that of reincarnation. Because conscious mind is a finite instrument and useless in dealing with infinity, even great religious thinkers of the past have been led into the trap of believing in reincarnation because they could not, with their conscious minds, conceive of any kind of existence at all without a body to accompany it. Only the Brahmins felt that true existence was unity with universal subconscious mind. But even they felt that a man must consciously come to this illumination, holding that he would go through successive reincarnations on earth until he attained it. No religious teaching has ever surpassed the enlightenment of the Hindus, with their Vedas and Bhagavad Gita and Upanishads, but even they could not forsake the illusory and transitory ego altogether, and thus they were led into believing that individual men went through successive reincarnations before attaining to Brahma. It is immortal self which is incarnating in search of self-knowledge, and only when knowledge of self is complete will reincarnation cease. The real you, the immortal self, will reincarnate, to be sure, short of its attaining complete self-knowledge. But the transitory you, the built-up thought habits and memories of the conscious mind, will incarnate no more, for it is only illusion, just a tiny instant in the eternity of evolution, whose very purpose is change. Ego will neither reincarnate nor persist after death. It is not the real you. It is scarcely even a microscopic part of the real you. Every incarnation is a reincarnation. Every child born is a reincarnation. For only one self enters into each body and looks out of all eyes and is conscious. Each of us is a reincarnation of every person who has preceded us. And the knowledge of all that has preceded us lies within us in universal subconscious mind, which has been all things and all people and all events, and will be forevermore. Infinite Spirit. Is there spirit communication? Not in the way we are accustomed to think. Those who have departed are no longer contained by the limitations of personality and ego and conscious mind, but have become one with immortal self. Yet the knowledge of all things lies in universal subconscious mind, and may be revealed to conscious mind when a contact between the two is made. So it is that the stance is often witness to unexplainable phenomena, for the subconscious always responds to the conscious and nothing is impossible to it. Therefore, the conceptions we have of loved ones projected into the subconscious are capable of becoming manifest in the physical world. We see ghost faces, hear words, sometimes in the seance, sometimes without the seance, which bring the dead back with us for a moment. But this is always a physical projection of a conception held in mind, and is just as often recorded of the living as of the dead. There is only one contact we may make with the hereafter, and that is with the one immortal self which dwells there. It contains all knowledge, all love, all peace, and is the true being of everyone. There are not billions of personalities circulating through it willy-nilly. Such finiteness has been torn from it and left it pure and unadulterated and just one. Never the Spirit was born, the Spirit shall cease to be never. Never was time, it was not. End and beginning are dreams. Birthless and deathless and changeless remaineth the Spirit forever. Death hath not touched it at all, dead though the house of it seems. Bhagavad Gita. No punishment in the hereafter. It is one of the strange facts of history that the words of one of its most enlightened men, Jesus of Nazareth, have been misconstrued to saddle mankind with the vengeful God who vies with the devil for souls. Conceive, if you will, of a God who gives men sex organs that provide pleasurable sensation, then promises to burn everyone in hell who doesn't use them within a strictly prescribed manner. Conceive of a God who gives men eyes but still remains invisible to them, then threatens to burn everyone in hell who doesn't believe in him. Conceive of a God who made the devil and his fires because he knew, in the first place, that he would burn certain souls. A mighty unsavory fellow, this God, this figment of the masochistic imagination. One cannot help but prefer his equally imaginative evil counterpart, the devil, who seems like a pretty jolly fellow, after all, considering the very poor job he has been given. Immortality is not something to be won by good conduct, nor will good conduct send certain souls to heaven, nor bad conduct send others to hell. Only oneself manifests throughout the universe, and it neither punishes itself nor rewards itself. It is eternal, and though it becomes a billion mortal things, its eternity is not touched. It passes into and out of myriad forms, but always remains one. Obviously, it neither sends itself to heaven, nor sends itself to hell, for nothing exists outside itself. Have no fear of hell. There is no such thing. There is only heaven. Consciousness of the immortal self, which each of us shall eventually attain, whether it comes to us in life or not. Every soul is saved. Misapprehensions concerning sin and punishment, and hell and the devil come from a lack of understanding of the message brought by Jesus. Jesus taught that the truth about each man lay in his spirit, and not in the physical world. When he spoke of sin, he referred to errors of thinking, buried guilts, and the punishment he alluded to was the inevitable physical manifestation of such negative thinking. By hell, he meant the human bondage undergone by each person who simply reacts to the physical world and fails to perceive his inner consciousness, the kingdom of heaven. He did not concern himself with immortality, for he knew that each person was immortal regardless, and nothing could alter this. He sought only to awaken men to their spiritual power, to turn their eyes from the physical world onto the consciousness that lay within, so that they might free themselves from lack and limitation and disease. He preached no afterlife. "I am come," he said, "that ye might have life, and that ye might have it more abundantly." The immortality of all men was obvious to Jesus. He was primarily concerned because they did not know how to live. The very guilts and limitations which Jesus besought us to become free of have been adopted as dogma by many facets of society, and they have thrown mankind into deeper bondage than ever. We must come to realize that God is kind and just and loving and is in us, and there is no punishment in the hereafter, and every soul is saved. We need not fear God. We need only love Him. We need not supplicate for forgiveness before an altar, for God's altar is our very selves. We are with Him night and day. Religions and temples are built by man, but God's temple is man. And wherever we are always in a place of worship. We need only turn to the self that dwells within. The art of dying. Birth and death are the great transformations. The ego does not fear birth, for there is no ego at birth. But the ego indeed fears death. As long as we identify ourselves with the ego, the fear of death shall have its hold on us, and we shall regard it as a great calamity. But once we have freed ourselves of the ego and have perceived at the center of consciousness the immortal self, death will become an adventure. For by it, we shall be freed of illusion, return to absolute truth, know as we are known, become united with God. Life is the medium through which the great self seeks to work out its purpose, and each of us is a part of that purpose and has his appointed task and work. When these are fulfilled, it is time for us to return home once again, but not before. Though the hereafter may be a mightier existence than any known on earth, we nevertheless shall not return to it until we have worked through space and time in search of the knowledge that the great self is seeking through us. Our jobs are here in life, and we must do them before we depart. Many men poison their lives through fear of death, since death is known to be inevitable for every man. It is indeed very strange that so little is known of the art of dying. For dying is an art, to be performed expertly or crudely according to our knowledge. To most men, death comes when the body has worn out and ceases to function, and is preceded by a period of time in which the body perceptibly begins to break down. As the hour of death approaches, the human soul has only two ways to turn: outward for the solaces of the physical world, or inward toward the universal self. A painful death, violent and full of suffering, awaits him who turns towards the outer world, for he is prompted by the ego which seeks to hold on to that which must be let go. Indeed, all that the ego needs for perpetuation, the memory, conscious intellect, animal faculties, the functions of the bodily organs, are gradually being wrested away, sinking into lethargy, ceasing to function, and the ego becomes confused, terror-stricken, full of panic. There is no escape for the hounded little I. Its doom is upon it. The very material world which is responsible for its existence is gradually fading away. He who identifies himself with ego undergoes a confused and suffering transformation. But he who has glimpsed the greater self takes death calmly, assured of immortality and the changelessness of spirit. He passes easily from one world to the other. His spirit lays down his body because it is finished with it, and moves into the greater expansion where it becomes Lord and Master over all things. Self meets self. The personal becomes the universal, and a new and greater existence in the infinite reduces the just finished life to nothingness, to a second in the endless time of eternity. And so we die as we lived, with faith or without it, with spiritual knowledge or without it, and according to the wisdom we have attained. We meet death gracefully or crudely, but each of us is immortal nonetheless. So live, that when thy summons comes to join the innumerable caravan which moves to that mysterious realm, where each shall take his chamber in the silent halls of death, thou go not like the quarry slave at night, scourged to his dungeon, but sustained and soothed by an unfaltering trust. Approach thy grave like one who wraps the drapery of his couch about him and lies down to pleasant dreams. William Cullen Bryant. Review. 1. Though body is mortal, a man is never born and never dies. 2. The presence that animates body is invisible even in life, and leaving the body and death is invisible still. 3. Oneself incarnates in all bodies and is deathless, ageless, eternal spirit. 4. Ego shuts us away from the knowledge of self. Ego deludes us into believing it is I. 5. The death of the ego must precede awareness of universal self. 6. Ego is as mortal as the body, and at death we all become universal self. 7. He who banishes ego during his life achieves power, for he moves with God. 8. Neither space nor time exist in the hereafter, nor does form. There is only consciousness, absolute and indivisible. 9. Body is merely used by immortal spirit as an expression of an idea. It is not self. It is but the tiniest expression of self. 10. The self enters into each body and becomes different according to what it enters, but upon leaving, becomes infinite and absolute, and only one. 11. There is no reincarnation for the ego, but constant reincarnation for the self. 12. There is only one form of spirit communication, and that is contact between conscious mind and universal subconscious mind. 13. All men are immortal. There is no hell, no punishment. 14. Jesus taught that the power of immortal being could be used in life. 15. He who perceives self in self will find death an easy transformation. There is an answer to every question, a solution to every mystery, a key for every lock. Throughout this book we have prepared for the final revelation. Now it is upon us. Recommended reading: Drama of Love and Death by Edward Carpenter.